I should have done the 2 minutes.
We already hit 30 seconds?
We already hit 30 seconds, believe it or not.
Thought I was
So Gabriel and I spoke previously, and it was really interesting. I don't think I've ever quite had an experience where I was talking to somebody new and we just agreed on everything pretty much, which was really interesting. And then Gabriel had some more time. He was like, hey, let's have another discussion. So, and without forgetting, there was, forget the name of the person who did it, but somebody took a lot of the things.
Ship Clerk. Ship Clerk is his X ID.
Right. So he made a composition, is all I could call it, of a lot of discussions that you've had, and he took a significant bit of it from the discussion that we had, which was, and he let me premiere it on my channel, which was a great honor, and I really loved it. I was surprised it hasn't been very. I thought it would be one of the most popular videos on my channel, but people haven't really looked at it very much. I don't know, maybe the algorithm isn't pushing it, but yeah, I really liked it. And yeah, so what do you want to talk about?
Well, I'd actually like to hear a little more about what you thought about that, because I don't think I've gotten hardly any feedback on that, which was what I was kind of hoping for, because I thought it was a pretty good summation, at least so far as the conversations I've had on what it is I'm trying to do and I'm looking for and I'm trying to accomplish. So I was curious if you had a little more, a few more thoughts about that.
So I'm one of these strange people who places myself, like I orient myself in the world mostly by what I disagree with people over. So like if you tell me, like if you name somebody, I will be able to tell you how I disagree with that person. I usually have a very hard time actually remembering things I agree with people that I agree with them about.
That's fair.
And that realization, I only came to that realization, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago. That realization helped me understand myself a lot better, because I realized, oh, I only notice how I disagree with people. And for me, I mean, we were talking about this a little bit before. Some people, like, they really dislike differences with other people, and they tend to avoid them, and avoid focusing on them and avoid talking about them, right? And avoid people that they disagree with because they even find it uncomfortable, right? And that's just not me at all. Like, I get bored a bit with people I agree with. That wasn't the case in the discussion that we had. Yeah, Dawn says we're wired to emphasize the negative, hard to resist it. But the thing is, it's not even, I don't even view disagreements with people necessarily. Like, yeah, our conversation was actually very interesting. At the same time, and I really liked listening. I actually listened to that video that Ship Clerk made several times. But I just agree with all of it. So it's hard for me to like say what exactly, and I did. I listened to it like at least 3 or 4 times.
No, I believe you. I can kind of relate to that. I think when I find someone very agreeable, I tend to either I already have in my system of beliefs a lane for that particular part of the conversation, whatever the topic was. So I kind of, if there's any subtlety that's different, I'll tend to just absorb that into my own perspective. So if I read something that I agree with, or I listen to something that I agree with, or I have a conversation, I'll tend to kind of just incorporate that into my worldview and make those small adjustments based on the interaction I've had. So I'm not offended at all. I totally understand where you're coming from, and I think maybe you've met someone whose agreeability. Well, I wouldn't say I'm particularly agreeable. I suppose I am, because maybe the way I deal with it is if I come at things with, I'm more interested in how you're right than how you're wrong, is maybe how I tend to lean,
Mm-hmm.
because I don't presume that anybody's a complete idiot. I'm sure they're out there, but I tend to come into any conversation with, there's probably something that this person has got right, and I'm curious as to how they've latched onto that and what they've done with it. And I kind of move into that space to find that common ground, and then as we relate on at that level, I can kind of, you find that space where you can kind of push around and figure out why it is that they've latched on to that particular truth or that particular perspective, and how they've kind of built their worldview. Because I'm so visual and I kind of think in spaces and shapes, I like to see it's like coming into somebody else's house. Like I want the tour, and I want to know about all your stuff. I'm not casing the joint. I'm genuinely curious about why you've collected this, why your artwork is the way that it is, what books you have. Like just genuinely interested in kind of building that map of who you are, and finding those parallels with other people in the way that we've experienced life and how we think about those things. So
I'm definitely a lot more judgmental than you are. If somebody's an idiot, I have zero problem dismissing them. So generally, if I believe someone is right in a way that I'm wrong, I will just adopt, hopefully, their view. If they're wrong in a way that I just think they're silly or stupid, I might remember, just as an example of why I think this person is silly and stupid. The people I value the most, the people who I pay attention to the most, are the people I disagree with. And while I may believe they are wrong, at the same time, I think they have a coherent view, right? So, I've been terribly blessed by Father Stephen DeYoung participating in my channel, because people come to my channel just to hear him, right? And obviously, we have very different views on things. We disagree on a lot of things, but so when it comes to the Dead Sea Scrolls, so one of the things that I've basically been saying is, so with the Dead Sea Scrolls, we all have our linear regression. Like we have data points and we have linear regression for what we think what the line looks like. And the Dead Sea Scrolls, especially over the past 20 years, have been just a lot of new data points on the graph of Judaism and Christianity, right? And so everybody is trying to fit these data points into their function, into their line, right?
yeah.
And the examples I give is, I think Father Stephen DeYoung, from an Eastern Orthodox Christian point of view, is integrating them. James Tabor, from a Protestant point of view, is integrating them. John Bergsma, from a Roman Catholic view, is integrating them. And I would say Robert Eisenman, from a secular/Jewish point of view, but partially because, frankly, I feel, and I'm I kind of feel like the data points all kind of matched the Jewish curve already in ways that I've already that I actually, so one of the things I say is like when I studied the Mishnah, which was redacted about 200 years after Jesus, I always thought it was anachronistically rereading the history of 200 years before themselves during the Second Temple period. And I was surprised by how much it wasn't anachronistic. I was perfectly fine with the rabbis of the Mishnah like being 200 years off on having an exact history of what happened during the Second Temple period. What I found out was that I was being too skeptical of how well they preserved the history. And the reason I'm telling you all of this stuff is because I keep those four views like separate, and I listen to James Tabor and Father Stephen and Robert Eisenman as much as I can. I haven't had a chance to delve into Bergsma, but only because he's not very active. He's more of an academic. He writes a lot, and I haven't read any of his books, which I probably should. I just haven't had the time. So it's not so much I'm right, you're wrong disagreements as much as you have an interesting point of view I might not share with you, but I want to know.
Do you think the kind of parallels in what I imagine are kind of just generally shared values, maybe that's an anchoring point for you? Because I would imagine that each of those people that you've mentioned, you align with them more or less when it comes to values, and a lot of that I feel would allow for an anchoring point of mutual respect that would allow for that space of argument to take place in a congenial manner.
I would say actually the opposite. I would say we have different values, but we have the same set of facts we're dealing with, and maybe a similar epistemology to some extent, but the theology is different, right? Okay. And
would you separate? And I'm thinking from my own kind of worldview perspective. Would you separate kind of a definition of the value set and a definition of your perspective on reality? Because I think some of that thinking in terms of the metaphysics, or however you want to say it, the theology of it, kind of deals more in the realm of a greater reality, whereas values is something almost more tangible, closer to the flesh, as it were, because of how we operate in the world and what we value, what we care for, what brings value to our lives, and what we think is most important on kind of a communal civilizational level. Like, would you see any sort of just general separation between the idea of values as something internal and reality as a broader experience? Because it seems among those different religious views, there's a separation on the level of reality, but generally in countries and spaces, communities where a lot of religions coexist well, they generally share a I think I'm saying generally a lot. I probably don't need to say it so much. They share a certain set of values that allows them to coexist in a meaningful way. And one of the ways in particular is economically. So if several groups of people are going to operate well together on that economic level, that's kind of where I see values landing to a degree, if that's making any sense. Curious about your thoughts.
How much economics have you studied?
I couldn't tell you. I've listened to a lot of content over the years.
Thomas Sowell, Basic Economics.
Yeah.
Okay. So one of the it's funny because I've been meaning to kind of do. We've been talking about Israel Kirzner on my Discord server, and I was not aware that he's actually a respected Orthodox rabbi, in addition to being a very well respected Austrian economist. Sorry. And one of his quotes is moral education of like the moral value of economic education is enough that it's worthy of independent pursuit of educating the public on economics. And I decided I was going to talk more about economics on my channel than I have been because of that.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the reasons why economic trade works so well is because in trade you increase the value of something, right? So pen, right? I may have 1,000 pens. 1,000 pens, like I can only use so many pens myself, and you have 0 pens, right? So one pen in your hand is worth so much more than my 1,000th pen, right?
Yeah.
And that's why we are able to have economic trade, which benefits the both of us, right? Is because the value that each thing has is different, right?
Yeah.
So I would actually say it's the opposite, right? So if you have a community that very much values a particular thing, right, and a different community that very much values something else, it becomes more. So to some extent, there is a diversity that, like diversity is our strength, can be true in certain ways because of that differential. At the same time, in order to have, like, you do have to have like an arenic, you have to have an arena that can contain the both of you within it in order for there to be a relationship between us. So yes, there does have to be some sort of ground. But I at the same time, it seems to me it's the difference which makes it. So the way I explain this is everything that has eyes has at least 2 eyes, right? Every creature that has eyes has at least 2 eyes. Why? Because like seeing from 2 different perspectives is just so much better than just seeing from one, right?
Yeah.
And similarly, I mean, this is what what's his name talks about with opponent. Vervaeke talks about opponent processing.
Yeah.
Right. And Ryan's really big on this as well, right? With opponent processing. So yeah, there has to be. I mean, in Ryan's terms, there has to be that rubber band holding the 2 of you together, right? With that thing he has. At the same time, the opponent processing is that tension is important.
Yeah, I guess the way I like the points that you made, and I agree generally. I think I think what I'm thinking of is values to me seem to emerge as the interaction between morality and perception is how I would map it on my own little attempt to kind of develop a worldview. But between morality and perception, so you think the shared morality, as you said, that connection between everybody, and I wouldn't say down to the details, but just generally on a civilizational level or a community level, there's a shared morality, and there has to be. And then in the case of values, if those two, perception and morality, are what are interacting, and it's their interaction out of which values emerge, that perception is the individual aspect. You have that the broader morality and the narrower perception. So you have those different views playing into the values, but they share the morality. So that's kind of how I would see that relationship. So I think in the way that you said that, I think we're more or less on the same page. But yeah,
I think we're using words differently.
that might be the case. What are your?
Yeah, because I think of values as kind of, so I think of theology as a hierarchy of values, right? And I do, yeah. I mean, in a Girardian sense, individuals have values which they gain from their community. So it's not so individual, but I guess it is individual. Like, there are things I value which my community does not value in the same way. Yeah, I mean, I haven't thought about these words in particular, and I'm not sure you're using standard definitions.
Yeah, I think maybe on the idea of kind of Pageauian levels, you could see how you could separate those out at the individual level, at the family level, at the community level, and how those group together based on those things. But the way I kind of think of values is a tension between a tension, not a tension, a tension between doctrine and doubt. It's like, because you're building this idea. Values has, I think, a lot to do with, saying what I value it in terms of theology goes into your doctrine. We were talking briefly about it before, the practice of religion, what you prioritize, how you order your days, your weeks, your months, when and what your holidays are. You kind of build that doctrine, which is the stable part of the community. It is the connective tissue. But there should be, in my opinion, a healthy amount of doubt, because that's the updating, that's the pulling apart mechanism, if you will, for sorting those things out and testing them as well, especially over a process of time. You say, kind of like talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls, there has to be a certain amount of cultural translation, and that would be kind of the idea of doubt coming in and opening that doctrine up, that more ancient doctrine up, and allowing you to move into that space and start to draw those parallels to your experience in the current culture, the current age, the current time. And so over time, I'm sure I'm not using it in a traditional sense, but I've tried to understand what values are in that sense. And I generally understand things in terms of relationship, which is a big theme more and more. I think Christian Baxter and what's his name? Dang it. We just had a conversation with somebody. I've got it right here. I had it in the back of my head, but I'm terrible with names. Stephen Osborne, and he was talking about how things more and more, even in the study of physics, you're finding out that they are relational, and that's kind of foundational to my approach. And so it's like, what's the relationship that what is the relationship in values? What is the tension in values? And I always felt like it was that doctrine and that doubt, and it was the tension between the two, and hardening down, and the extreme would be dogma, or blowing apart, and the extreme would be terror, because the idea is terrorism is the sowing of doubt. It is the pulling apart. It is the dividing and the injection of division into a community to break it apart. So that would be the extreme, and obviously, rather in the case of dogma, it's that hardening down and the closing of the city gates and the thickening of the city walls and becoming something that can't change over time, can't improve over time, can't absorb new information and adapt as it moves along through the broader narrative of progression in any sort of sense. The change in weather, the change in climate, the change in economies, the change in leadership and domination and national boundaries, all those things. You have to have, you can't be so hard lined that when you run into something that would threaten to destroy you, that you can't adapt to the new situation while maintaining a valued core of tradition, which are those well-tested things over time that we try to hand down to our children.
Yeah, my only problem is a lot of times in our, I'll call it the Jordan Peterson sphere, the people who don't like the term Jordan Peterson sphere, specifically Luke Thompson, when they talk about the importance of the relational, they seem to be using it as a negation of the importance of the objective. And while I very much like the Verbachian use of the transjective, and I do think that is true, at the same time, I have a strong reaction to the subjectivism that some people display.
Could you define how you're using subjectivism just a little bit more? I mean, I understand the term, but just how you're using that.
So this will be distasteful to people, but oh well. Food Truck Emily on Twitter has left. Well, her account ended up being banned because she had become a toxically anti-Israel, right? And in the beginning, I tried very hard to, like, I consider myself non-Zionist, even anti-Zionist. I am a harsh critic of the state of Israel. She was going way beyond, and I tried reaching out to her and stuff like that, but like to the point that certain things which she was tweeting out, I actually, like, I said it out on my Twitter, right? Look, these are the examples. This is not an acceptable thing, right? And the response I got, especially from the people who are relational, right, was, well, like, that's you, and she has her thing, and I care about my relationship with you, and I care about my relationship with her. And it was like, I'm sorry, like, this comes down to real life impacts of views and expression and advocacy, and it's affecting real human beings in their lives. So this falling into relationality, I would say that subjectivism is, well, that's her truth. And it's like, no, that doesn't fly with me.
So, and I can't comment on that specifically because I didn't see any of it, and I've only had positive interactions with her. So, and I'm not going to make a judgment one way or the other, but I'm curious, when you talk about subjectivism in that way, is that when this subjectivism is moving into the role of the objective, is kind of what it sounds like? It's applying my truth, as you say, to the truth.
It's negating, it's overriding, right?
Yeah. because on that note, though, I'm curious because kind of going back to the idea of doctrine and doubt, the way I map these things out is there's a subjective and objective on either side of those things because those things are in tension together. So there's more or less a conversation going on between them. So you have the subjective and the way this gets, I'm trying not to go too deep into the technical aspects of it, but you can think of kind of the subjective experiences of the two, and then the objectivity of their perspectives is kind of twisted into the other one. So the tension between them is formed as that. So just to kind of map it out so that I can explain where I'm coming from. And so when the conversation is happening, it's like you turn into each other's experiences to a degree, and there's a back and forth between the subjective and objective in order for a decision to be made. So you think of the conversation, there's the subjective experience of the two, and then twisted into the other is kind of you could say a submission one to the other. And as you try to navigate that conversation, you're trying to come to, in any conversation, a sort of agreement in some way so that you can make a decision and move forward. Because in any relationship, whether it's just talking about this or that, say in a business relationship or otherwise, or a family relationship, and you're trying to make a decision for the family, you have to move into that state of tension, and then you have to have the conversation. But at some point, someone's objectivity has to submit to the subjectivity of the other. Like the dominant one has to take a dominant, and a decision needs to be made in those particular circumstances. So you can kind of think of it as sentence structure is how I'm kind of thinking of it, is this subject, object, verb. And you have the primary parts of yourselves, and then you have the secondary parts of yourselves. And in order to form a sentence, which would be subject, object, verb, you have to decide who's going to submit to who in order for a decision to be made. So upon making that decision, the space collapses because the statement is made in subject, object, verb. And so that's kind of my perspective in a nutshell of how I'm thinking about subjective and objective. And I think you could think of it too in writing a sentence, subject, object, verb, in the case of someone who has moved into that space of applying their personal truth to the general truth, is you could write that sentence as the subjective, their own objective, and the verb, rather than incorporating the other in the decision that is made, if that makes sense.
I think I understand what you're saying. I would probably reframe it in terms of when you're talking about a dialectic, right? You have thesis, antithesis, synthesis, right?
It gets into like the computational stuff for me is how deep it kind of goes. So I'm trying to, and this is useful for me to try and kind of draw these things out in a conversational format instead of just relying on the diagrams. But sorry to interrupt.
Yeah. So when you talk about a thesis, antithesis, synthesis, there's a sense in which some people think of the thesis or the antithesis kind of overwhelming each other, which obviously is wrong. But even when people think of the synthesis, in some manner, they will remove the thesis and the antithesis from the plate, right? As if it could exist, as if the synthesis could exist without the thesis or antithesis, right? And that's kind of like the Marxist dialectic, right? So he had this idea that like society went through feudalism and then went through capitalism and then will go through into communism, right? And so he saw capitalism as, so he saw like this evolution in which the other parts weren't part of it. I think my problem is sometimes when people think of the dialectic, what they should recognize is if the thesis and antithesis are each worthy things of existing, right? If the dialectic actually matters, then they should not be, they should be unified under the synthesis. They should not be obliterated in this, in the synthesis, right? So if you think of it, I mean, now I'm talking about physics I don't understand at all, but like matter, antimatter, if you're thinking matter and antimatter nullify each other into nothing, right? As opposed to, no, these are two things which have a tension between them, but when they come together, the synthesis doesn't obliterate either one.
No.
Now, when people talk in a way that I would be critical of in their subjectivity, I think they're arriving at a synthesis that kind of gets rid of the thesis and the antithesis, if that made any sense.
No, I definitely get what you're getting at. And I noticed in the comments, a couple people are commenting on subjective. Adam Dillon Major said, I don't think grammar use of subject and object can relate to the topic of point of view, and objective perspective can only be achieved if people take their subjective background less seriously. And I think I partially agree on that, but I'd have to say your subjective experience and I think is separate from your objective perspective. So you can kind of think of, I have a certain set of truths that I see as objective, and that's something that's evolving over time. So that the idea of there being a transcendent objective, you can think of in terms of conscience. It's something you're aligning yourself to, but your objective perspective is inadequate and incomplete. So you need to further refine that over time. So it's not that the objective is something that is set or something that is stone-like in your own self. Maybe out there it is cut in stone like the Ten Commandments, but your interaction with that is very organic, and it develops over time. And in the same sense that your subjective experience is separate from your perspective, because you could think of it as that external and internal as well, like how you're relating to the outside and how you're applying that to your state of being on even a hormonal level on the inside. Like, how are you dealing with anxiety? How are you applying the objective subjectively? Like, how are you understanding your alignment with what that transcendent reference frame, as Jordan Hall likes to call it? How are you aligning yourself with that, and how close are you to it? How close is your objective understanding, and how integrated is that with your own subjective experience? So keeping those things somewhat separate. And I think there was one other, I'm also having trouble relating, new at this. Also having trouble relating subject and object in a sentence to the idea of subjective and objectives. And I'll admit that's still something I'm trying to figure out myself to clarify, but you can maybe look at, so you have the two individuals, you and I, Jacob, we both have our subjective experiences and we both have our objective understanding. But in order for me to submit to your subjective experience based on a decision we need to make between each other, I have to submit my objective understanding to your subjective experience.
Hold on, you can't have an objective understanding. That's the problem. That is the problem, right? Each of us has a subjective understanding. The objective is that which is not dependent upon our understanding.
But I think that's separating the transcendent objective versus how we've packaged the objective in our own mind. So you think of our perspective is limited.
Right. And that is what subjective is. So this is why this is funny, because it seems to me that your understanding of objective and subjective, excuse me if I'm wrong about this, but it seems like you've gotten it from a Vervaekian point of view and not from how it was being used before Vervaeki.
Maybe if I can, let me see if I can clarify it a little bit more, because you think of kind of in the case of the objective, you could put that in terms of reason,
mm-hmm.
and the subjective more in terms of how to separate this. Give me just half a minute to think about this, because you can act in different ways. You can act more. Think of a rational approach and an emotional approach, and kind of how I'm separating these things, I think, is the subjective experience is much more on the end of the emotional approach, how you respond to things physiologically, how that enters into your being when you you see something on the news, you experience something in life, someone wrongs you, someone does something generous for you. That to me is the subjective experience. But if you operate, and you can operate in those two spaces, and there's value to each, but if you are prone to one or the other, it comes back to that idea of doctrine and doubt. If you're prone to being more in the objective space of your own mind, as you align yourself with that transcendent, you tend to become more dogmatic, because you're limited in your view and understanding of the objective and your ability to reason based on the information that you have. So you've built this model of the objective. But part of what opens that up is your emotional experience and navigating things, and how you apply what you've reasoned and rationalized to how you regulate your own experience internally. How again, going back to the idea of dealing with anxiety and managing your wants, your desires, your addictions, whatever it is. And so that's kind of how I'm separating in that sense, because I don't think we can say I'm objective. It's like, yes, we're all objective, but it's a balance between that internal experience and that, I wouldn't call it necessarily external, but that rational alignment with that transcendent objective truth that some of us believe is out there, some of us don't. I personally believe that there is a transcendent reference frame to which all our consciences are more or less aligned, and we can sear it to one degree and the other, and no longer get that data, but we are limited in our own minds to building that model, because it's not that we have the objective, it's that we have a model of the objective. And how is that separate from our subjective experience? And so that's, if that clarifies anything at all, it's the first time I'm really having this conversation about these things, but that's kind of how I'm separating that. And going back to the conversation of kind of coming into relationship and having to make a decision between the two of us of how to move forward together, my reason would prevent me, if I were so dogmatic, to subject myself to the intuition of the other in making this decision based on predictions, which is not something that is known. So the truth of that, what's going to happen in the future, the truth of the future is somewhat outside of that objective, because we don't know. So to a degree, there's an amount of intuition that needs to be brought into the conversation. And you have your intuition, I have my intuition, you have your understanding, your objective model, and I have my objective model. In order to make the decision based on what you think is right, what you feel is right, based on the reason and your experience and your intuition and all of that, I have to submit my reason to your intuition in order to allow that decision to happen. Otherwise, if I refuse to do that, then we will stay at odds with one another and will not move forward. If that clarifies a little bit.
It clarifies that you're using the words in very different ways than they're generally used.
Well, I think I use them differently because I don't think the way they're generally used is clear enough. So I'm trying to understand more deeply. Like we talk about these things and people will use these words, and then my brain will be like, well, I mean, I don't feel like the idea of building a tool set or building a relationship or refining and making things more efficient, because I'm very much the engineering mind. That's a lot of what I do for work. And so the definitions, it's in, for me at least, as people just use them in general conversation, are not very useful. So the reason I move in, just to clarify hopefully further, the reason I'm moving into this, thinking more deeply about these things and trying to define them in a way that's useful to understand how we interact with each other, is if we're going to improve upon, kind of like Jordan Hall's project he had a conversation very recently on Karen's channel, which was great. Recommend people to check that out. But talking about the idea of different cultures coming together and how are we, and integrating on this new level of connectivity, like how are we having those conversations? What are the things what are the moving parts, and how do we isolate them in a way that is useful so that we can understand them and build out from there? It's not necessarily that this is definitely that and there's no gray areas, there's no fuzz around the edges. It's we categorize and recategorize constantly in our own lives. And so we have to think about these things in a way, in the modern context, in the context of the conflicts we're having and the levels of division that we're currently dealing with. We have to think about those things in new ways and kind of take those categories and move them about a bit so that we can understand them more thoroughly and come up with a tool in order to solve the problems that we're having. So I would say you're correct that I'm not using them in the traditional sense, but I'm doing so deliberately because I don't think the traditional sense, even if I couldn't necessarily articulate what that is entirely, because everybody has their own little thing, is not adequate for the problems of the current day. And I'm going to stop because you can see I'm starting to spurg out, or whatever the term is these days.
What do you mean?
Oh, just I'll start to go on those roles, and I'll just wander through the space in my mind, because again, everything's kind of laid out. So if you get me on a certain thread, I'll just go and go and go and go, and then end up looping back on the same thing. So I don't want to say the same thing over and over again. So hopefully that was coherent.
Yeah, I'm starting to understand you better, I think. You're moving into areas of philosophy which I know very little about. I'm not very interested in phenomenology and even metaphysics. Because I go back to what I find comfortable and useful, which is a Jewish metaphysics. You seem to be talking about qualia and meaning, two words that I don't think have proper enough definitions, and so I don't use them very often. But so let's talk about practically, right? So there's this pen on my desk, right? And you perceive that there's a pen on my desk. I perceive that there's a pen on my desk. And we would say that's objective, and that's our perception of objective reality, right? Then there is the relevance that we each assign to this pen on my desk. Obviously, it's so far away from you that it's pretty irrelevant in your life, whereas it's on my desk, so it's pretty relevant to me. And there's emotional attachment, right? Like, okay, this pen I got, it's actually from an internship, right? And I brought it home from the place I was interning at, and so it has an emotional significance to me and sentimental value, which is in no way important to you. And I think that's what you are calling um, the subjective, the subjective reality of this pen, right?
I like the example, and if I may,
Sure.
so we need to make a decision about the pin. It's like, should we throw it in the trash or not? And to me, objectively, it's just a pin. There are lots of pins. They generally have the same value and are capable of the same things. So in my mind, that pin is, say it's running out of ink, but you're keeping it for personal purposes. And if I went hard line, it's like, no, it's just a pin. Its value in what is exclusively in what it is able to do in the physical, in relation to a piece of paper. So it makes sense to throw that one away because it's cluttering up your desk and get a new pen. But I would have to, in order to make a decision to keep the pen, if we were for some reason tied together in a decision that had to be made, I would have to submit that objective reality as I see it to your subjective experience, your intuition that it has enough value to you that moving forward in the future, it will be worthwhile to have that token of some past experience remain in your life. And if I care for you as a friend, I can take that reason, that hardline reason, and put it in your court, and we can make that decision to keep the pen because you understand that it has more value. Though I may not understand that, I care for you and can relate to you with maybe things I have in my life that are cluttering up my desk, but it's like, no, this matters to me and I keep it for this reason. And so I can relate into my own subjective experience. We can connect in that way, and I can set my reason down at your feet as a sacrifice to make the decision to keep the pen. So it's that sacrificial relation that we have, because I have to sacrifice my reason in a sense to you in order to support your subjective experience going forward, at least in that particular case.
Yeah, I don't think, I mean, ultimately you're talking about the sentimental versus the material, right?
But I wouldn't boil it all the way down to that, because the two things affect each other in the sense that if you have a certain set of sentiments in your space that set you in the right space of mind, and you move into this space and it changes you physiologically. It's like, okay, I'm sitting down to work and I have these tokens, these totems, these things that bring me into the headspace of creativity, of productivity, of learning and education. In the case of your classes, I don't know if you're going somewhere, if you're doing them online. If you're doing them online and you have this space where you enter in and it sets your mind in, brings your mind into a form that allows you to work effectively on what it is that you're trying to accomplish, that's going to affect the material world. So in the same sense, that's the importance of the intuition and valuing emotion and valuing feelings to guide the reason, because you can break things all the way down into a nice little set of reasons, but in the end it's going to handicap your ability to navigate effectively in the material world, because you've narrowed things so far down that you aren't taking into account how your environment is affecting you and how that effect is flowing back out into your effect on that environment. If that's makes sense.
Yeah, no, I mean, so I think PVK has been talking about the same things in terms of the material versus spiritual, right? He talks about school spirit, right? That's what he says, and he's been trying to um, he's been trying to talk about the spiritual in terms of uh, when that which binds us to other people. I actually think that's too limited a way of looking at it. I think the spiritual also exists in the individual, right? So I can individually be possessed by a spirit, right? Um, yeah, we don't have, well, partially because of the materialist framework, we've completely negated the value of the sentimental and the spiritual and the emotional um, and I totally understand where you want to take that and I think we do need maybe Vervaeke needs to start making new words, but yeah, I don't think that maps onto the problem that that I've been talking about in terms of objective, subjective, and transjective, right? Because um, like I don't think, for instance, the I really don't think the difference between um, most of what separates me from food truck Emily, for example, is um, is completely a question of sentiment. Although there's that as well. We have different understandings of how the world exists, like the facts of the situation, right? And that's
Well, and that would be your two objective perspectives warring against each other.
right. And
so
that's what I mean by subjectivism, is this idea that how I perceive objective reality and how you perceive objective reality are both necessarily flawed, and so that our understandings are subjective, right?
Well, I think no, that's a great point to bring up. I think that's when, coming back to the idea. So if you're going to resolve this conflict in some way, the way you would have to do it, you can't, and you see this you can watch this happening in the political realm right now as well. You can't, when someone's having an emotional response to something, and as you say, their subjective experience is overwhelming their or ill-informing. Is, you think of the emotion again, going back to guiding the reason. You're using your emotion, you're heeding the emotion to guide the reason, but you're testing the emotion with reason to see if those emotions are accurate. So someone is having an emotional response, and it leads them to reason in a certain way, and that reason, rather than being reflecting back in that as a tension between the person and helping them develop their understanding and testing those things, it just becomes an emotional loop that builds on this one avenue of thinking. And so you can't throw your objective perspective at their objective perspective, because that's got a main line to their emotional response. So you kind of have to go past this part of the person and start to connect to them emotionally. And that's, you see Paul do this so much. He's just, I would say, a master at it. is connecting with people on a deeper level, so that when you come back around to that conversation of facts, rather than going to this sensitive, I wouldn't go so far as to call it as a wound, but it is kind of an open sensitivity when your emotion is running a loop into your objective perspective. So that's subjectivism, as you're saying, and I would see it as kind of consuming in a way, and dominating that perspective. And so any sort of attack with facts, like facts don't care about your feelings and all that jazz, is going, again, a main line to the physiological response of the individual. So you're not going to get anywhere. So that's not, you can't convince them. You can't convince them with facts in that space, because you have to.
I really have to disagree with you. Like, yes, I understand pragmatically there are irrational people who are incapable of actually dealing with reality as it exists. But I judge those people as deficient.
And you're not wrong to judge them deficient, but the idea is, and I think maybe this is like the little spot where we're missing it, is because I'm kind of like what you talked about earlier, how I approach people. It's, this person thinks this way, and I'm curious as to why that is, but I can't touch this thing. In the same way Paul talks about navigating his conversations, it's like he'll come up on something, and if he just pokes it a little, it's just, there's this immediate defensive response. He's like, oh, I can't go there. So the idea is, it's not that you are wrong and that they are deficient. We are all deficient in various ways, but it's those deficiencies. It's mapping out those deficiencies and then finding a way, an avenue in which you can address that. Thinking of a marriage relationship, it's like this particular thing related to some trauma in my wife's childhood is just a hot button topic, and I can't bring it up. We can't talk about it. But as I build the relationship with her and connect with her more on an emotional level, the defenses of that thing slowly recede in my presence, because we've built a modicum of trust that allows us to be more vulnerable with each other. And so I'm thinking of it in terms of practically solving the problem, because what your identification of the issue with the individual is correct. And you can say, this is what you are deficient in this way. And you may very well be right. But at the same time, if you want to overcome that, you have to start to think about tactically how you're going to solve that problem. And
but a completely valid tactic is to completely sideline that person.
Absolutely, but I would not say that. And again, you made an effort, so I'm not saying you did it wrong. But and I'm sure we'll come back to agreeing on this. It's not that shouldn't be necessarily, depending on the extremity of the situation, the first move.
Shouldn't be the first move.
Yeah.
But my problem is people who are like, no, like they're like universalism, like the trinity of evil, pacifism, universalism, and anarchy.
Yeah.
Right. Like this idea that there is no line,
Yeah.
right, at which I say this person is not worth the trouble, right? And I can totally understand. I mean, so the joke is, I'm a communist with my family, I'm a socialist with my friends, and I'm a capitalist with everybody else,
Yeah.
right? There are concentric circles of responsibility and bothering and stuff, but what really bothers me, and I think becomes a problem, is this totalizing of what you could call weaponized compassion, right? So at some point, I am willing to say this person is causing more harm to everyone because of their deficiency, right? To a point where I have to say, no, this person needs to be excluded. And I blocked her from Twitter because I just wasn't going to deal with that anymore. And she doesn't have a Twitter account anymore, which I had nothing to do with. But and I don't know what the specific reasons for that were, but I'm glad it happened.
Yeah. Well, again, I'm not familiar with the particular situation, but if you, as you're saying it, or everything you're saying is correct, it would make sense to have someone like you in a community who would be like, okay, we've reached the line, and now you've moved beyond it, and you're outside the city walls now.
Yeah.
And so I don't deny the value of that. I guess that comes back to the kind of the difference between you and I. We talked about if you mentioned if you think someone's an idiot, you're not interested in their opinion. And the way I approach, if I think someone's an idiot, I'm curious about where they're smart. So it's like you find someone who's bombastic or over emotional on Twitter, and I wouldn't necessarily do it on Twitter, but in a real life situation, if I'm interacting with a person physically, like in the real world, I'd be curious if that opinion came out, which it would be less likely to, but if they tended to have just broad general opinions about things that just came out in little blurbs that they've already written down and refined, and I thought they were stupid, I would avoid that onslaught and kind of try to move around the side and figure out where they're smart, because that's far more interesting to me. It's like, okay, oh, this guy's a plumber and he's a wizard, and so there is something in him that is extremely capable of understanding systems, but that something is not being applied to this particular system.
Well, okay. So first of all, I have to say, in real life, it's a lot easier to go along with that type of thing. But at the same time, you are making an assumption which is a useful assumption, right? Which generally is a good assumption, but it's simply a good assumption, which is
it's not always true. It's not always the case that I'll find something smart about everything.
Yeah, some people are really, really retarded, like actually retarded.
But right? I think that's why we need people like you to stand at the gate and be like, "You're out, you're in," and people
right.
like me.
You have to have that. Yeah, you have to have that. Which I completely understand the necessity for that opponent processing.
Yeah.
What I don't like is, as opposed to the necessity for the opponent processing, we seem to have fallen into a situation where it's like, no, we don't actually need somebody like Jacob. If we got rid of Jacob, we wouldn't have a problem anymore, right?
Yeah. No, that's a perfect
opposite of the truth.
That's a perfect way to think about that, because I think kind of what I'm moving towards, and in concert with what you're talking about, I think what we lack generally is an understanding of how to order our communities in a productive way, where we put Jacobs, around the edge here, and we put Gabe's in this space in the middle, and maybe outside the walls meeting other people, and then it seems we've lost the ability to identify the value of an individual and their own propensities and tendencies, and to place them ideally in the most effective space that they can be, and then to build our community based on properly placing people in the roles that they'll thrive in. And this goes back to the idea of sports and kind of building that hierarchy in a team. It's like, not everybody's going to be the quarterback, and I think Pajot uses this analogy constantly, maybe in another way, but not everybody's going to be a linebacker. Not everybody's going to be good at snapping the ball. Not everybody's going to be fast enough or be able to jump high enough to be a receiver. So it's just, you compete with each other and
And
you
not
build.
everybody gets to play football.
Yes, but you also need people coordinating the roster. You also need people, filling up the water bottles. And so the idea that there isn't a place for everybody, I think, is a stupid idea. There are limits, like you say. Sometimes this person needs to be outside the city. And you know what? That person may even be useful because they're camped out in the wilderness just beyond the walls. And they'll be very likely, if they're far enough out, the first to know that an enemy army is coming, and they'll run screaming in, please let me in. The enemy is approaching. And so the idea that even the crazies don't have a value, I think is wrong. It's just a matter of.
I mean, I have to say, I believe in one creator, therefore I believe every creation exists for a purpose.
Mhm.
God, if you believe God created everything, then everything exists because God created it. And if you believe in an omniscient, benevolent, and omnipotent God, right, everything, in fact, does have its purpose, right? And I have to say, it's a lot more comfortable being the person who's being nice than to be the gargoyle, right? I oftentimes call my role the gargoyle, right?
Yeah.
Because like I think you ultimately need gargoyles, and people certainly don't like being the gargoyle. There are people who imagine that I enjoy being a gargoyle. I'm good at it. If you think I enjoy it, you don't know me very well. Um, and sometimes like I have to show people like, yes, this is like, no, I do not enjoy this.
Can I ask you real quick? Do you think your position as gargoyle has kind of been, because I know you've talked about your interest in social work and your compassion for people who need that kind of help. And I feel like the extremes in society push people like you who would be in a role, a more, maybe even more nurturing role, up onto the wall, because that's where you have to be in order to nurture your community. Because if you can't be in that space, because that space may not even exist because of how extreme things have become.
So I was perfectly happy when I started my Discord server. My Discord server was where the people who got banned from Bridges of Meaning could come. I invited everybody who got banned from Bridges of Meaning to my Discord server, and my Discord server, I called it an exile from Bridges of Meaning. So
Yeah.
it was all the people who, like, I was servicing the lepers, right? That was and I am perfectly fine being the person servicing the lepers.
Yeah.
What ended up happening though was people Joey ended up leaving, and I became the guy outside, sitting in my sukkah outside the Nineveh, like preaching repentance, right? um, so yeah, I mean, but so to go back to what I was thinking of, which is my beef with PBK's "Don't Take the Bait" video. Did you watch that?
I may have listened to it. If he posted as a podcast, I probably heard it. You'd have to refresh my memory.
It was recent. First, it was behind the paywall, and then it came out. Which it was him talking about Pajot, and he's talking about Jesus as a cultural warrior, and he was telling people not to pick sides, right? Because in his view, Jesus didn't pick sides, and the way I put it is, if your Jesus could get murdered, he's not Jesus, right? If
You
your
said could get murdered,
could not get murdered,
could not get murdered. Okay.
right? If everybody loved you, like that's not the Jesus of the Gospels. Is not the person who nobody has any bad things to say. In fact, in at least in the Gospel of John, every time he opens his mouth, people want to kill him more, right? Um, like, and there's this idea of winsomeness, which I think is just a form of cowardice, which is, oh well, I just want everybody to like me, right? And there are times when the correct thing to do is to I'm thinking of this one particular thing where there was this family, and um, they had an adult child which they were still treating like a little child, and I just humiliated the parents, right? I actively made fun of the father. I was like, do you think you are being a father? Like, what kind of a father are you that you have a grown child who can't act like an adult? Like, where are you in this family as a father, right? And like, most people aren't going to bother saying that,
Yeah.
right? But there's a point at which you just have to go, hey, you have an adult child, you have an adult son here who can't be a man. Why is your son not a man, and why aren't you helping your son be a man, right? And
Sorry, go ahead.
I get nothing out of that other than being hated.
Yeah. Well, I think that comes down, and this is something I've worked on in the past, and I've never seen anything done about it, but you think of the idea of empathy, and I kind of separate that into kind of a masculine and a feminine empathy. The feminine empathy is I put upon myself the experiences of others on an emotional level, and I experience to the best of my ability what they're experiencing. Something I feel like we've lost, or maybe we haven't even identified well enough, is the idea of a masculine empathy. And what that is to me is the felt weight of the potential in others. And I see in you someone who feels the weight of and maybe you wouldn't articulate it in this way, but the way I would interpret it from my own perspective, you feel the weight of the potential of this child to be a man. And someone, by not holding that child to account, is preventing and undercutting a foundation upon which that child can build himself up and fulfill the potential of his purpose, as we talked about a moment ago, the purposefulness of each individual. And so that masculine empathy is identifying and feeling the weight of the potential in this person that is not being met, and then having an emotional response to that, and out of love, addressing the thing that is holding them back. And if that, in the case of this situation, is the father, then what you did was a movement of compassion for that child who will suffer, maybe suffering, will continue to suffer, having not been able to find that purpose, build that foundation, and come into the form of what he was made to be. And so in my mind, what you did, although extremely uncomfortable, was an act of love. I'm assuming you had the right attitude about it, but it was an emotional response for you. So it was an empathy, like however you felt it or understand it. It was an emotional reaction, and then a reasonable what you saw as the issue. And it could be that you were wrong and there was some other situation going on, but the odds are, if you were close enough to it and you saw what was going on and you understood the situation, that what you did was correct. And so I understand why you get hate for that, because that's where we're at. We're in this, how to put it, this feminization of masculinity. So it's like the feminine is moving into the masculine role, but instead of holding these people to account, it's, you can't hurt anybody's feelings. We can't push, we can't hit, we can't shove, we can't crush, we can't lift, we can't move because you might hurt somebody. And it doesn't need to be in that space. It can't be in that space because you have to have that relationship of the nurturing and the growing and the encouragement but that mother has to turn the child out and impress upon them the value of discipline. And the father has to reach into the family and hold them to account as they're growing and allow them to move out with the discipline of the mother and the accountability of the father, and draw them out and put them out in the world. And if we're not fulfilling those roles, and however both mother and father move between those spaces, so it's just a generalization, but generally speaking, those roles, if you over nurture, if you are the over mother, if you are even a father submitting to, and I don't know if it was the mother who was doing this and he was just allowing it to happen, or if the mother in some cases wants the child to succeed, wants them to get out, but the father isn't stepping in and providing that accountability to a boy who needs to become a man. It's like, yes, the mother's trying to apply the discipline, but if she doesn't have that mutual support, the child is going to just continue to have these false starts in the most difficult situations, of course. I mean, some kids figure it out, but
the image that comes to me is like a lobster that it's molting out of its shell, right? I think sometimes you have to crack the shell to allow it to grow, and
especially if somebody's taping that shell back together while the lobster's trying to get out of it. You have to come in with your box knife, slice that tape open, and let the thing out.
Yeah, it's like, yeah, and
someone will scream violence. It's like, no, yes, but no.
Yeah, and I mean, I also default to Ecclesiastes for everything. There's a time, and yeah, it just seems to me that we've moved into a place where people who claim, oh, I love everyone. You love everyone except the people you don't love, and then you claim that, oh, well, that's different, right? And it's like, well, it's just so frustrating to see the hypocrisy of it, right? It's like, and I think that's part of what's going on in our political life, is people see, oh, like, yeah, we love everyone. We're tolerant. Love is love, right? Well, unless you're a Trump fan, and then we can talk about how it's perfectly fine if you get shot while in the audience, right?
Yeah.
It's like, yeah.
Well, the way I look at it is I think of it in terms of will, and the tension in will, going back to the idea of tensions, like in values, you have doctrine and doubt. In will, what you have is the exclusive and the inclusive. And so that kind of touches on what you're saying. Love to me is a measure of the will, is a measure of will. So if you love everyone, you're overemphasizing the inclusive aspect, which is that mothering tendency. And everyone included, everyone gets what they need. And that, like you said, I'm a communist with my family. Everyone, bring communism all the way out to the borders of the nation so that everybody can be inside. And it's obviously that doesn't work. But that tension between inclusive and exclusive is necessary at the different levels and among the different communities and families and all of that, because in order to exercise love, it has to be applied towards the well-being of those you include in the group at whatever level. And the group has an identity. And if you start to allow, like you've said before, people who don't belong inside that wall into that space, it's going to break the identity of the group. And what was love has become a demented form of infantilization or over affection of something that doesn't belong in that space. And that's a hard thing to sell, and it's a hard decision to make. But we're constantly making, like you said, even the people who love everyone are still making those inclusive, exclusive decisions, and their will and their love is identified by their desire to improve the well-being of those inside their group. As diluted and misguided as it may be, that is their intention. But again, a lot of people lack the tools to actually understand how to make that move forward. But all that aside, yeah, you can't do family communism at the national level. I think we could agree on that.
Speaking of which, people in the chat, play nice. If somebody doesn't want to talk to you, stop talking to them.
Yeah, I was looking at it, and at the beginning it was kind of topical, but I don't know where they went, so I've kind of...
Yeah, well, so Adam, who is very welcome on my server and on my channel, his English is not the best, and like they got into an argument about translations, and it's like,
oh. So there's a whole nother conversation going on right now.
Yeah, and it's like,
yeah, I'm very green on this streaming thing. I've had maybe a dozen conversations, and I'm entirely new to the chat because I've always been on my phone. So that now I can see it on my desktop here.
And you are an admin. You have admin privileges.
So. Oh, that's right. Yes.
Yes.
And I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was kind of offline. We'll have to talk about more about like how to do that, because I've been having conversation with Wild Iris, who's Glenn, Upcycle, Harris, and Ryan. I meet because we live pretty close to each other, but we've been having conversations on the sort of making things level.
Mm.
They've been really fascinating. So I was looking for a possible venue so we can talk about that more, about having conversations that are maybe other people can interact with. So I'm almost entirely ignorant to the StreamYard stuff. So I appreciate you folding me in and
yeah, I'll definitely. I mean, we can when you have time, I can help you test drive, and I generally allow people who I trust, which I do, to stream on my channel. So if you are interested in streaming on my channel, you can. You can also stream to your own channel.
We can talk about all that later. I just came to mind.
Yeah, my project has been trying to elevate voices that I think speak reason, and like I want to change the signal to noise ratio, because I see very little signal and I see a lot of noise, and so I've been trying to reduce the noise and increase the signal as best I can, and it's difficult, partially because not all things which are signal are things that I necessarily agree with, right? So, like Michael Sartori, David Busuttil, and Jason Almontree, Schweitzer. All three of them have admin accounts on my channel and can stream to my channel. And all three of them are people I consider to speak signal. At the same time, yesterday they had a book club on the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is like, why is this on my channel? I have 2.5 Trinitarians discussing the Epic of Gilgamesh on my channel. What? But it's partially because I want to see a world where not necessarily that I am speaking, because I actually get bored of what I myself have to say. But like today, earlier, I had a conversation with somebody I found on Twitter. His name is Trace. He goes by Trace Woodgrains, and like it was a genuinely really interesting discussion because he's a smart guy. He knows a lot of stuff, and when we were talking, I didn't necessarily agree with the stuff that he was saying, but I still have to go back and actually listen to the conversation again, just to try to pick up all of the stuff that he's that he said. It's okay, David. I'll still allow you to stream on my channel. I'm not sure I would have. I personally would not have led a discussion on the Epic of Gilgamesh. I don't think it relates to Genesis well or in any worthy manner. But that's beside the point. Yeah, I mean, like, it would be really, really nice if I didn't hear anybody that I thought was just saying stupid things, then I wouldn't want to be creating content because I would be listening to all the various things, and I might not listen to certain things, right? I might not listen to it. In fact, I didn't listen to the discussion on well, I listened in the beginning, but not the rest of it. But like, there's a difference between something that I may not personally be interested in. I'm actually not very interested in the things Vervaeke has to say because they're just not things that I'm interested in, most of the stuff. That's fundamentally different from somebody who's saying stupid things, especially if those things are harmful. Mm-hmm. That's actually one of the things I was talking to Sandy about on my Discord server. Like, there are certain ideas which are very dangerous, right? And I am willing to confront the intelligent proponents of them. I don't want to see a lot of people who don't even understand them talking about these dangerous ideas, and that's what causes me to sometimes just want to pull my hair out, which is kind of difficult. You may have noticed.
Now, I think the kind of the difference between discussion and sermonizing is like somebody comes in and turns your platform into a soapbox and starts espousing those ideas. I mean, I feel like coming in, if they're willing to have a discussion about their ideas, there's a point where that's acceptable. And then again, as you say, it comes up to a line that if they're not willing to understand the perspective of others or make any sort of adjustment to how they see things, then, you know, that just turns into it hardens into a set of platitudes that nobody's interested in. Even if they're positive platitudes and you generally agree with them, if someone comes in and then it's just this line after line after line after line, it's like, this isn't interesting. I'm not interested in listening to this. You aren't you aren't interacting with each other. You're just throwing things at one another, and
That's really
nothing interesting is happening.
okay. That's really interesting because I really enjoy a good sermon.
I agree. But
I
I really hate a bad sermon. It's very unpleasant. I mean, there may be a line where it becomes comedy, but there's that like lukewarm space of this is painful, and I need to get out of here.
yeah.
So
Okay,
what was
so
it?
that topic. What else did we talk about?
We were going back and forth a little bit a while back on Twitter about the question that came up in the conversation with was it Pajot and Alex O'Connor, and they were talking about or that question that continually comes up: couldn't God have done it better? Like, couldn't he have done it better? And you said,
the stupid question.
Yes. And I agree with you that it's a stupid question, but what fascinated me and what interests me in that question is what the logical hangup is. And again, this is me. So if this question is stupid, how is this person smart? So it's like Alex O'Connor, by all accounts, is a very intelligent individual. I've enjoyed listening to him on many occasions. But it's interesting that this question comes up so often. Couldn't it have been done better? Couldn't it have been done differently? And from an engineering perspective, when we're building something, working on something, incorporating something, trying to add a new aspect to an old thing, anytime we do, there's a system of trade-offs. And I know he understands trade-offs, but I don't know why that understanding of trade-offs doesn't rise.
It's not even the thing of trade-offs. What Alex O'Connor is not recognizing is he has a God. He has a God who he is using his God to judge the God of the Bible.
It's his own reason, right? His own reason, his objective model has been lifted up on the altar place.
He has a God. Like, in order to judge God, you have to have a standard by which you judge God. This is the number one thing when somebody talks to me about slavery, right? The Bible is insufficiently critical of slavery. And my question is, like, what is your standard by which you say slavery is wrong? And what ends up being is, and the atheists always do this. They say, I'm making an internal critique, right? Because obviously the Bible says slavery is wrong, right? And it does. The very first commandment is, I am the Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt from the house of slavery, right? That is the first commandment, right? So, and the entire story of the Exodus, Moses, the 5 books of Moses, is escape from slavery. So the Bible obviously thinks slavery is bad, right? And it's something the Bible says over and over again. But they're like, but it's not anti-slavery enough. And the question becomes, where is that standard coming from? If it's from outside, if it is able to judge the Bible, right? Where is that coming from? And the fact is, it's that the person who's making that judgment is in a sense forgetting the lessons of Job, right? Mm-hmm. What does God answer Job? He's like, where were you when I set the foundations of the earth? Right? Yeah. It's like, who do you think you are to judge me? Right? And that's why it's a stupid question.
No, and I agree entirely that it is a stupid question, but I'm curious about, and yes, the aspect of God, like setting one's reason up on the altar of worship, and you see that in some, we won't even get into how many different places you see that in, but in the case, again, coming back to the engineering perspective, just thinking about how you could have that conversation, because it seems to come up, and your explanation of why that's stupid resonates with me, because that's how I understand it as well. But that explanation, it's like quoting scripture to an atheist. It's not effective. So what was curious, and the conversation I was interested, an ongoing conversation I'm interested in having is understanding the leaps in logic they're taking down at the level of understanding how they're reasoning about these things. It's like take a particular system, and it's like if you make any, say as an example, a combustion engine, it's like I want it to go faster. I'm going to pour more fuel in. It's like, well, the volume of the cylinder isn't sufficient, and we're not getting enough air in because the air intake isn't large enough, so that you're going to flood the engine if you try to use fuel to make the thing go faster, make the thing run hotter, make the thing more effective in that way. You're not going to get faster by constantly increasing the fuel. You have to balance all those systems together. So it's curious to me that that I know they're capable of, and they see it in a larger system. And I think stepping from the material into the metaphysical is also a difficult step to take, especially if you don't even necessarily hold a meaningful perspective in that realm of thinking. Because in the same way in the material realm, you have to make these certain sets of trade-offs in say biological design. There's a certain set of trade-offs that you're all constantly working in this particular system, in that particular system within its environment, and that ecosystem of all those systems alongside one another in that larger system. And so it's curious to me that these very logical people, and I think it is, and I think me talking this through, maybe that's what it is that complete sweeping aside of the metaphysical side of things, and not thinking of terms of, it's like, okay, there's biological trade-offs, but what about philosophical and metaphysical and moral trade-offs? Like, what does that system look like as well, and how are they ignoring it entirely? How are they thinking about it that's causing them to bring this stupid question up again and again? It's like,
you are not hearing the question the way Alex O'Connor is hearing the question, because his question is not, how do I make this engine go faster? His question is, why are we using an internal combustion engine instead of jet fuel, like a rocket propulsion, right?
Yeah.
And in order to address that question, right, you have to move into the frame of, okay, now we're talking rocket propulsion. You're telling me why am I using internal combustion versus rocket propulsion? Like, we only have, like, I don't have jet fuel. Yeah. There's no jet fuel here. Why are you asking me about a jet propulsion engine?
Yeah. Well, I think too, to add to your point, and what you brought up was great, because you thinking of it's like, why are we using this system? Why are we using an internal combustion engine instead of a rocket engine? It's like, well, that brings it into a conversation about purpose. It's like, what is the purpose? So what is the purpose of this? Why didn't God do it better? It's like, well, what better in what sense? Like, why are we in this form? And if you can't identify the purpose of the form, then you can't say, well, this form's not fit for that purpose. And then you have to go into a war against, well, I think that purpose is stupid. But that presumes that you've identified the purpose correctly. So, and I totally get what you're saying, and I agree that, yeah, he's not even. I guess if you're not willing to apply a purposefulness or allow or identify a purposefulness to the system you're critiquing, then you are incapable of critiquing it, because you won't understand how to you'll want to throw that out and bring in the system that you've kind of imagined with a lot of logical gaps. It's like, this would just work because everybody's happy, everybody has what they need, no one's suffering in any severe way. Like, why can't it be like that? It's like, well, maybe it can, but is there a process of getting to that place? Why did we have cars first, then planes, then airplanes, then jet planes, then rockets? Like, there's a progression. I think of going back to what you said about slavery and the idea of raising a child and paralleling that with biblically, you see God raising a society. And it's like, do you teach that child first not to hit or not to hate? And it's like, well, you teach them not to hit because that's something they can understand early on in their development. And in the case of building a society, it's like, what are the things that a young society is not going to understand until they develop to a certain level of maturity? And the way I look at the Old Testament, or what did Jews call that again?
I usually say Hebrew Bible.
Hebrew Bible. I like it. So when I look at the Hebrew Bible, I see a God raising a society in the same way that a parent raises a child. It's this constant progression of maturity and increased understanding, and maturity and increased understanding, and then that loop of failure and returning and learning the lesson again and trying to progress. And from a Christian perspective, obviously that goes off into the looping was part of why Christ came in, to break that loop, but we don't have to go all the way into that. But that's kind of just a touch on how I see it. But
we can discuss it. Like, I think the simple answer is, if you think that loop's been broken, you're not looking at the same world.
Oh, no, I wouldn't say it's been broken, but there is, from a Christian perspective, an avenue forward now. You can run the loop still if you'd like. You can continue to run that loop, or you can start to progress towards something. And again, this is something. We're gonna have to save this for a whole another stream, because I know you and I, that is the place that we differ most. So just to dwell on the idea of raising a child and the idea of raising a society, like I think there's a really strong parallel to the idea of teach a child not to hit, and as they grow, you can teach them not to hate. You can teach a society to treat their slaves well, and then over time you can teach a society to let their slaves free. And that's the progression, because one is better than the other, and one requires a certain level of understanding, maturity, and even a certain level of development, because so much of slavery biblically and in that era was deliberate self-indentitude, whatever the verb is.
Well, to some extent, yeah.
Yeah, but, and not to go all the way off on that tangent, but that as the resources expand, as what is available is more available, like all of that, it makes it, as you build the civilization, it allows more room for people to take care of themselves, take care of their own families, to a distribution of resources and trade, and that growth that allows a space for everyone. And I know, yeah, I'm going too much off on a tangent, so I'm going to stop, because I'm going to start looping.
I just wanted to point out that in that discussion, I think Pajot was pointing out to O'Connor a lot. Well, this describes reality, right? And O'Connor just did not want. He was criticizing this God in his mind of, well, my perfect God would create a reality that's different, and it's not sufficient for me that the biblical literature describes how reality exists, right?
Yeah. Now that you mention that, I remember him addressing it as, well, this is how it is. And like you said, Alex O'Connor kind of warring against that. It's like, well, why couldn't it be that way? And that comes back to the idea of purposefulness. Because I think what, and I'm just thinking out loud here, I think what part of the issue may be is the idea, it's like, well, we're not existing for any particular purpose. We're just existing. And so why can't this existence be more pleasant? And it's like, well, you don't understand, going back to Job, you don't understand what I'm doing. You don't understand what's happening. You don't understand what's being aimed at, what is being brought forward, what's being formed, what's being made, and what will become as a result of the trajectory of all that's been put into motion. And so and that's kind of the looping idea. It's like, if we're just in this loop of existence till the loop ends, then we cannot, all we can do is critique the loop without an understanding of where that loop is going. And it's kind of like the idea, bringing in Vervaeke and something I don't know if it was him. It was many people. I think it comes from someone else. But that idea of spiraling upward. It's like, if you look down on it, it's just a loop. And so their perspective is looking down, and I think that's very appropriate, looking down on the ordering of creation, the law that's been put in place to create an autopoietic system of systems that can self-regenerate and move itself forward, and looking at it, looking down on it. But when you take that position more of humility, you can see that it's not looping, it's rising up. It's moving along a trajectory, and it's becoming something more. And so, yeah, I think what it boils down to for my own sense of conclusion is that it's just a matter of, quite simply, a matter of perspective.
I think for me, it's that O'Connor doesn't recognize what perspective he has.
Yeah.
He thinks he doesn't have a God when he does. And his God doesn't describe reality, which is a problem.
Yeah. So just real quick, I think I hear my family getting back, so I'll probably have to wrap this up shortly. But I'm curious, if you were in Pajot's shoes at that point in the conversation, how would you address the wrongness of that perspective? And I guess that maybe isn't a fair question, because then that would come down to, like, what kind of relationship do you have with the person, and do you have all those avenues you need to have that conversation in a meaningful way? But
no, I think Pajot did what was necessary.
Yeah.
The only thing, I mean, he usually is the one who's asking, where are you standing where you make this decision,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I think Pajot did it right.
Yeah.
The problem is, you can't solve a human being.
Yeah, no.
You can't solve Alex O'Connor.
Yeah.
Right? He is who he is, and he's capable of what he's capable of, and he will respond how he responds. And at some point, you have to be like, okay, Alex O'Connor has gone the way of Sam Harris and just needs to be discarded.
I think he's still searching, though. Do you not get that impression?
I do, and ultimately, like I said before, I believe in one creator who creates everything, right? So the Jewish version of love your enemies, which actually is from the Bible, is love all creations. And the way the rabbis explain that is ohevet habriot, is love people whose only redeeming quality is that they were created, right?
Mhm.
Because everybody in existence has that redeeming quality that they were in fact created, right? Um, so and that takes you into very difficult and dark territory. But at the same time, just because someone was created um, doesn't mean that they don't need to be um, not even just left outside of the city, but sometimes you need to wage a war against them,
Mhm.
right? And that's the thing. People and it's cowardice. Yeah, I realize that going to war is distasteful,
Mhm.
and we don't want to do it. And if you listen to my discussions with Chezi and Gilad when we talk about like Israel, you will hear I am the biggest proponent for fleeing rather than fighting, if at all possible. But that's the question, right? Like, there's a point at which you have to be able to turn around and punch the guy who's coming at you in the face.
Absolutely.
And there are people who claim to be pacifists, right? Again, I have to say the unholy, the satanic trinity of universalism, um, personalism, and anarchy, right? They they really do end up destroying everything. They aren't. Nobody can or does live by them. And aspiring to the absurd is itself a huge problem, right? If you aspire to, oh, if somebody, God forbid, breaks into your home and does horrible things to your wife and children, and you aspire to be the man who does not pick up a gun and shoot, like you're aspiring towards evil. What? That's aspiring to not be a man, right? If you want God to redeem everything, right? If you want Hitler to be saved, right? There's 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 a place in you which refuses to love justice.
I think it's an excellent. No, I like that. What comes to mind is the way we all have a tendency, but pacifism to a degree is a removing oneself from the difficulty of the calculation of morality, the moral calculation. Because you think of the idea of good and evil, or good and bad, depending on what you're talking about in particular. Um, the tension in morality, I feel like is coming back to that idea of relational tension in the system. Is mercy and justice. You have an over application of justice leads to contempt, and an over application of mercy leads to lawlessness. And pacifism seems, in many cases, a way to simplify your understanding and exclude yourself from that complicated calculation. It's like, I'm a pacifist because this is hard. Making this calculation of whether this situation that I'm confronted with requires justice or mercy is difficult. Therefore, I place myself above that calculation and put myself in this nice, comfortable little bubble where I don't have to do that hard thing. And so that in my mind, that's what comes to mind when as you were saying that, is so often we see these hard decisions that must be made, going all the way back to what we were talking about the conversation and the sacrifice that has to be made in order to move forward. It's like I am uncomfortable making those sacrifices. I am uncomfortable having that conversation. I am uncomfortable making any sort of decision. So I'm going to some would say cleverly, but I'd say not so cleverly, create this little crystal ball of ideal space that lives just above this hard reality of living in this world. And I can exist in here and look down on all those people who are just not enlightened enough to withdraw from to detach oneself from the difficulties of this hard reality. That is the truth. That is the way forward. Detachment, to be free of it. It's like it's incorrect.
It's not only cowardice. It's bullshit cowardice.
Yeah.
It's self-delusional, condescending cowardice. And frankly, the only way to confront something like that is with a lot of ridicule.
Yeah, no, I think that's a big part of why comedy has seen the explosion it has recently, is because what we're dealing with in and I can't speak to other nations, but in particular in this nation, is this high-minded creation of these well-curated little crystal balls that can look out onto the world in their little space of protection and pass judgment on the unenlightenment of those still wrestling with the hard reality. It's like, no, you need to enter into the wrestling match. You need to develop your strength. You need to develop your understanding. You need to fail, and you need to ask for help, and you need to continue to put your nose to the grindstone, as it were, and learn to navigate this difficult space in order to create a better society. If everyone lifted up into these crystal balls, what that is a form of stagnation.
And Gnosticism.
Yeah. Yes, that as well. But that Gnostic idea, that stagnant idea, still requires, even to form that stagnant idea, requires an enormous amount of resources. And the idea that this thing that you're feeding off of is going to continue to perpetuate as you all rise above it. It's like, now no one's running the system. No one's doing the hard thing. No one's getting behind the toilet and fixing the plumbing. We're just looking down on it, and that's not how shit's supposed to go. It's like, well, and then as you continue to draw the resources up, eventually they deteriorate, and this little glass crystal ball comes crashing down, explodes, and you're left to the bare reality of an entirely deteriorated system. And that's when you see mass death. And so the idea of, like you said, ridiculing these people who've set themselves on high and encouraging them with love, with humor, and trying to crack the space of that and draw them back down into the hard thing. Do the hard thing. It's the only way forward. But everything you're looking for to form is in that process. All the joy, all the satisfaction, all that flitting butterfly of happiness, the only place you're going to find it truly is getting your hands dirty and being a part of that system and making the most of, again, back to positioning people in the spaces they will thrive, so that this system can become more efficient and more effective. And not only can we make it operate well, we can rise to another level together. And that's the raising up. That's the moving up. It's not rising above it and looking down on it. It's cliche to the umpteenth degree, but it is coming together and rising up together. But it's that hard thing of making those difficult decisions, entering into those difficult calculations, coordinating with people that you don't necessarily get along with, and finding places for them and for yourself in relation to one another to make things work well.
Well, you apparently have to go, as we can hear.
Yeah.
But one modification I would like to make, it's not going up together as much as it's building a hierarchy where people find their place and you elevate what needs to be on top and you recognize the importance of what needs to be on the bottom and building a structure that can actually stand as opposed to trying to float above it.
Yeah. And I agree with that. I think the way I'm looking at it, and just for a quick clarification, is I agree you build that hierarchy in the same way that you build a sports team. And then that team moves to the finals, moves to the state finals, moves to the national finals. And so that hierarchy together, as you build up and down, also can move up and down as well. And so that's what I meant as far as kind of moving up a level. It's not that we're all equal or even or fulfilling the same roles. Like you said, we are building that hierarchy, and then that together, that thing can progress and move forward. So I am in agreement with you once again. So I hope that wasn't boring for you.
Oh, I love this.
Continue to agree with one another.
Yeah. No, actually, I mean, we had some disagreements. I've learned a lot more about you than I knew before.
No, likewise, and I've really enjoyed this, and I like talking to you. And as I mentioned in the last chat we had, your honesty, willingness to do the hard thing and address it, however imperfectly you may, in whatever the given moment is, you're gonna do it anyway because you know it's right, and that's extremely meaningful in a conversation as we try to make a decision and so that we can move forward. So I think you act that out very well, and I appreciate that about you.
Thank you. Okay, you want to end the stream?
Yeah, how do I do that?
It's on the top right.
End stream.
End stream.
Big red button. Got it.
Yes.
Well, thank you for everybody in the comments. I did not keep up with what you were talking about, but I'm glad that you're here. And thank you, Jacob. And I will end the stream. We'll talk to you soon.